Hi, welcome to the 2020 Web App Tech Stack webinar. My name is Emily Nielsen, and I am the Community Manager for GraphCMS. And today, we'll be having a webinar from Jonathan Steele, our Jamstack and GraphQL expert, who has over 3 years of experience building and working with headless APIs. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to drop your questions in the chat on the side on YouTube there, and we will come to them at the very end. We'll have a little bit, probably 10-15 minutes to answer questions. So then, without further ado, I'll pass it off to Jonathan. Jonathan, I'm looking forward to hearing and learning more about what 2020 looks like in terms of web app tech stack.
Thanks, Emily. Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Before we dive in, just a quick kind of overview of what we're going to be covering today. So we're going to be kind of looking at how market and business requirements have changed in the past 10 to 15 years and the kind of effect that's had on building the web. What the web landscape actually looks like in 2020 in terms of development tools and software services, what those tools teams should be using to meet these changes in market demands and business requirements, and also where GraphCMS fits into that equation. So building for the web is hard. It's always been hard, but in 2020 it's particularly hard. And really that's because the internet now is more accessible than ever before. There are many varying portals to the internet on all of the devices that we interact with daily, whether that be a visual portal, a touch-based portal, even voice or virtual. So the consumer expectation now is that your brand be present across all of these channels. And without that presence in the kind of culture of 2020, which is the expectation of always on, you're kind of missing out on business, and your customers will begin to look elsewhere. So really we need a new set of tools and services to help make building for this internet market easier. So the market demands performance engaging experiences, and this is particularly problematic for websites. There's an expectation that websites be globally available night and day. And really, there needs to be a focus on creating performance and compelling brand experiences to delight and excite our users. And those experiences must work really seamlessly across a range of devices, whether that be a laptop, a desktop computer, iPad, phones. People aren't just browsing the internet on a computer anymore. They need to be accessible anywhere at any time. And really, there's been a kind of a rise in native digital businesses recently, and that has been kind of disrupting the market, the traditional consumer industry market. And these industries have been revolutionized by kind of web-focused businesses. The web is their only channel for business. They don't have a brick and mortar store. So what that does is that allows them to kind of focus entirely on the web as their sole channel. And in turn, they've often introduced new or streamlined business models. Web performance and experience are important, and they're especially important as far as business metrics are concerned, and they are mutually tied. And this is particularly important for commerce brands. Consumers are becoming more and more savvy, and the market is becoming more and more competitive every day. So if your web presence is slow, insecure, unavailable, or lacking in features, then what's going to happen is your visitors and customers are likely to begin looking elsewhere. And these aren't new insights. Over 10 years ago, Amazon, it's a brand you might have heard of, They discovered really that for each 100 milliseconds of page latency, there was a 1% decrease in sales. So that's quite a significant impact on sales. So if web performance is affecting a massive brand like Amazon, if it's affecting their consumer confidence in their brand, then imagine the impact that that could have on your business too. So if you go back in time now, say 15, 20 years, during this time, it was particularly challenging to publish anything to the web. And then the invention of the CMS happened, and really the CMS was born to solve that problem and bring content publishing to everybody. Now, there's some familiar logos on this slide: WordPress, Drupal, Magento. And these are all common, popular CMSs that made publishing to the web easy, particularly for people without a technical background. These products offer a kind of a single entry point to creating and managing content, building your website, and even publishing it to the web. What also ties these three CMSs and others together is their focus to provide a complete experience, a range of functionality. Rather than doing one function exceptionally well, they kind of attempt to do every piece of functionality. And what that results in is often a poor experience or half-baked features. This version, the original version of the CMS, is quite frankly outdated or archaic. So if our business requirements have changed and the market has changed, and now the CMS is somewhat outdated, we need to kind of reinvent the idea of the CMS. So the premise and the concept of the CMS will fundamentally still remain the same, but the actual execution and how it's implemented has evolved to meet the business requirements and market demands of 2020. No longer are we tied as content creators or developers to a single feature stack of one CMS, but instead we can cherry pick the best features from the best services to fulfill all project needs. And this is kind of trending towards a more modularized tech stack or a modularized architecture. So under traditional CMS architecture, the CMS would attempt to be responsible for every facet of your website. Things like forms, search, page creation, even the user interface, obviously the content management, how it's hosted and deployed to the internet. The CMS was responsible or tried to be responsible for all those areas. And that approach often did an average job at everything rather than actually delivering a great job at some one thing in particular. Now, at the time, 10 to 15 years ago, this was often the only option available to people looking to publish or sell online. And nowadays, though, this is not the case. In the idea of a modularized tech stack or a modularized architecture, we can really orchestrate best-of-breed microservices together. In this example, and this is quite a convoluted example, we have multiple services here. You'll recognize a few of them, such as Stripe, Algolia. And all those services serve a single function. So Stripe will handle payments, Algolia will handle search. And in the middle of all that is GraphCMS, which is the tool that kind of composes them all together. So in the past, your CMS would have attempted to fulfill this entire architecture. But now we can actually delegate feature responsibility to specialty services. So for example, Shopify, if we want to sell online, we can sell online with Shopify and actually connect all those services together using the developer tools available to us. So if the CMS architecture of old is outdated, then what changes are actually happening in the market that are forcing an evolution? There are three key areas of change, in my opinion, that have kind of forced our hand. It's a change in business requirements. There's a maturing market for software services and significantly improved developer tooling. So your business requirements have most definitely changed since 10 to 15 years ago. I imagine now your company's content service stack is broad and varied. You're probably utilizing multiple services to house content and using features from kind of best in the business providers. And the challenge with that approach is actually kind of bringing all of those things together, orchestrating them all into a single experience. Another kind of difference from 10 to 15 years ago would be the growth of SaaS, and that's software as a service. There's a much broader landscape now than ever before for software services that fulfill business needs. Previously, a CMS would manage all of your content. Now we can actually take this best of breed approach with products fulfilling certain niches. Some of those niches might be search, e-commerce, payments, analytics. These are all examples of growing competitive markets for each of those features. So these companies here, it's just a handful of examples of best of breed services that really specialize in one particular area of the market or one particular feature. Stripe, obviously, with payments, Auth0 for user authentication, Shopify for commerce. You've got Algolia for search and indexing, and then Segment for analytics. Now, 10 years ago, I'm pretty sure none of these companies existed 10 years ago, and if they did, they were very much in the startup phase. But now they're ubiquitous across the web in their respective fields. So really, we as developers and as business managers, we want to be able to harness these services for the functionality they offer independently of one another. And then most importantly is actually bring them together into a larger architecture of our web systems. Another change that's happened is massive improvements to developer tooling. JavaScript is ubiquitous in front-end development. Really fantastic tooling available with JavaScript now on the front end. Using a tool like JavaScript, using a language like JavaScript and the tools available is a much more desirable approach to building web experiences. Previously, you'd be using the kind of walled garden idea of a traditional CMS. So now being able to use a set of tools like React, GraphQL, that provides a much better baseline and the flexibility to deliver better web experiences. So gone are the days of having to use out-of-the-box features that your CMS had just because there wasn't a better alternative or there wasn't any scope to build a better solution yourself. And as well, the advent of serverless. And in recent years, there's been a strong emergence of serverless computing. And in this particular context, that pertains to Lambda functions or serverless functions. And those have really brought a kind of a new perspective to how we develop applications. So serverless functions, they run on a per invocation basis. This leads to a lot less expensive to run. Run costs are a lot expensive as opposed to a traditional server. There's obviously no servers or databases to maintain or create yourself or manage. You don't have to worry about that. Obviously, there's no state maintained between these function executions. So that kind of leads them nicely to fit in the event-driven system. So they play nicely with webhooks and events that we can actually tie services together with trigger actions. So considering all of these changes and advancements and the evolution and stuff, how do we actually build for the web in 2020? So really, we must kind of assess all these new avenues of possibilities and changes. And really, there's three kind of stakeholders, three key stakeholders to factor in when making decisions about how you will build for the web. Obviously, the first one would be content creators, the people who are actually creating content, managing the content. What kind of tools and services do they want to use? What are the best tools and services available to them? Obviously, the developers who are building these web experiences, they should also have a say in the services that are used, but also the tooling that's used on the front end to build these applications. And last, but by no means least, your audience, the end users, they are the most important stakeholder when building, because if nobody visits your website, then you likely don't have a business. So all of these groups are unique and they have all different requirements. And what's important is to remember in the past, a lot of the times we wouldn't cater for all of these stakeholders. Most times we would, we would pick the best development tools, but it wouldn't necessarily satisfy the content managers, or it wouldn't necessarily be the best result for end users. So what's important is that we consider all of these when making our decisions. And really, that means we should have no more trade-offs. And innovation across the industry, such as better tooling, better software services, and just the general availability of technology, that's improved the workflow of everybody who works on the web and the efficiencies of each of those people. And they're all kind of heavily linked to each other. So we can utilize these improvements and deliver a better web experience for all three of our stakeholders, rather than kind of just making one party happy as in the past. So with content managers, they are particularly keen on the birth and the rapid growth of headless CMSs. It's very much the era of the headless CMS. Headless CMSs like GraphCMS, they've kind of revolutionized how we think about creating and distributing content on the web. Now, distributing via multiple services, that allows for the best of breed approach that we've talked about, picking the best service fit for purpose. One example for that might be that we manage a blog on GraphCMS, but our products that we sell are managed in Shopify. This kind of approach, this modular approach, has been coined the content mesh by Gatsby. We'll come to them in a bit, but the challenge we face with this kind of modular approach is bringing everything together, orchestrating all these services together into a beautiful unified experience. And developers, last but not least, advancements in JavaScript, particularly, and front-end development tooling, kind of make the old approach of enterprise CMS development a thing of the past. This is very much the era of JavaScript on the front end. Developers now, they want to work with modern, lightweight, performant frameworks. These frameworks that follow modern conventions, they're component-based, so that you can build modular code that scales up and down. So that's the kind of how developers want to work. And popularity of kind of JavaScript frameworks like React and Vue, they've kind of driven this approach, and the ecosystems around them has really driven this approach. So if we just do a quick kind of comparison of how this has changed over the years, obviously on the traditional enterprise on the left, you've got that kind of linear CMS, one CMS approach, limited and often poorly supported plugins. Maybe you did want to pull in some data from elsewhere, but you're often at the whims of some plugins, as opposed to headless CMS. We got third-party APIs, extensive open source libraries. And then on the developer side of things, not only is the developer environment significantly better working on the front end, but we've got this idea of serverless and CDNs now. We don't have to worry about distributing our content on servers that we're hosting or databases that we're responsible for. We can abstract that pain away to cloud providers, Amazon, Google, etc. And yes, of course, all of this comes down, all of these decisions is essentially an output for a single stakeholder, and that's the end user. And what they want really, ultimately, is a fast, secure, reliable experience. So the decisions we make regarding content services, regarding developer tooling, those decisions, the result of those decisions is what affects our end users. So we have to remember that and bear that in mind. So really, we've got 3 unique requirements and 3 unique challenges. So we need to kind of approach this with a fresh mindset, completely different to how the traditional CMS would work. So what does the content web tech stack look like in 2020? So with these kind of prior limitations of old CMSs in mind, we need to really select a new set of tools and services to kind of meet the needs of our 3 stakeholders, so we can deliver performant, beautiful web experiences for them. And as we've established, JavaScript is kind of ubiquitous on the front end. It's developer tooling is second to none. So really looking in that area, there's some tooling in particular that will help us. And I think we should start with React. So React is a kind of UI framework, originally released in 2013. It's open source, created and maintained by Facebook. And React is massively popular, and the developer community kind of is rallied around that. And there's some great open source tooling, there's some great open source libraries built around React. And that's really a compelling reason to kind of use a framework like this. The popularity of it drives developer involvement, it drives libraries, it drives tooling. So that means you can kind of rely on other developers to build tools that you might need. And there's just a few features really that have resonated with developers that kind of React has introduced, and that's JSX, the component-based approach React kind of really made that a thing, and obviously the virtual DOM. So those are 3 things that developers love about React. And since it was introduced in 2013, it's kind of slowly become the de facto JavaScript framework. It's still steadily growing at a healthy pace. This is a chart of NPM downloads over the past 2 years, and we can see there's 3 times as many downloads now as there was 2 years ago. So it's grown massively, and we can see Vue as well is grown too. But one concept that of the web that has been around for a while now is this idea of the Jamstack. Now, the Jamstack itself is very popular now. It's resurging alongside this CMS, headless CMS era and the era of JavaScript and React, but it's been around for a while. And what Jam stands for in Jamstack is JavaScript markup and APIs. And that in itself fits very nicely with our approach of a modular tech stack. So static sites have long been popular for building fast and maintainable sites. Jekyll is an example of a very popular static site generator. But I think the problem with static sites up until very recently has been that the kind of developer experience and the developer tooling has kind of stagnated in this space. So with the birth of React and JavaScript becoming more and more popular, I think it was about time we saw kind of a new take on static site generators. And that's kind of where Gatsby comes in. So Gatsby kind of, it's what I would call the static site generator for the 21st century. It's more commonly known as a React, a compiler for React applications. So it's an important differentiation there, because it's a common misconception that Gatsby is a static and just static. That's not the case. We'll come to that in a bit, but you can build dynamic web apps with Gatsby. So how does Gatsby as a tool actually help us fulfill the needs of our three stakeholders? Well, out of the box, Gatsby delivers performant websites. When you run Gatsby build, you get pre-built static HTML, and that HTML is compiled from React components and source files. So with Gatsby, we get those familiar developer tools like React, so we can build those modular, scalable code and components that we want, and then not have to worry about it being compiled into static assets, because Gatsby takes care of it for us. Gatsby as well comes with a lot of performance optimizations out of the box for free. But best of all, Gatsby, the static site, as I said, was a misconception. Yes, it delivers static assets and they are fast. But what actually happens with Gatsby is it actually rehydrates into a React application. So this allows you to actually, as a developer, to actually build dynamic experiences. So you may need to fetch data dynamically. User authentication is possible as well. So you can very much build dynamic web apps with Gatsby. Superior developer experience, really, I think that's pretty much a common theme with anybody who's used Gatsby. If you ask them, they will tell you that the developer experience is fantastic. As I said, it's built on top of React. So what you get with that is the React ecosystem, the familiarity with the DSL and syntax. And of course, you've got all that access to that wide range of React libraries, React tooling. A lot of those fit and work well with Gatsby out of the box. Talked about the kind of developer tools, but with Gatsby you get hot reloading with development, the optimizations, we get kind of bundling, code splitting, transpiling. Those are just given to us out of the box. Fantastic benefits, really, just by building with Gatsby for free. Yeah, so our content creators, this is what they're more interested in, is being able to kind of source the content from where they need it to. And with Gatsby, we can kind of bring all of our content together into, to orchestrate into a single experience. So we can pull our page content from GraphCMS, commerce offerings from Shopify, and maybe even blog posts from local file system, markdown files perhaps. So what that allows us is our content creators and the teams creating content to use the tools and services that are best suited for that job and that they prefer, that they're most comfortable with. So no longer do they have to shoehorn a particular service to fit their requirements. They can just kind of cherry pick each service for each particular job or fulfillment. And this kind of idea of bringing content from various sources and bringing it all together, and that's kind of made possible with GraphQL. So inside of Gatsby, we have GraphQL, and we've got the kind of consistent developer experience and interface. And Gatsby as well has a huge array of source plugins, and those actually allow you to kind of pull data from popular third-party APIs. So as I said before, the resultant build of a Gatsby site is just HTML and JavaScript. And as a result of that, the site itself, the static assets, can just be kind of deployed to a CDN. So things like Netlify and SiteNow, we can just kind of push those static assets up to there and then inherit the benefits of a CDN, such as the reliability, speed, distribution across the world, and also the security. Most CDNs now have free SSL provisioning, so we can get all of that without having to worry about maintaining a server or a database. So that approach with CDNs and the static asset, that kind of ensures that our audiences across the world will have access to our site securely, regardless of where they are or what time it is. Gatsby as well has a very strong and upcoming open source ecosystem, really. It's got a thriving community, especially for plugins. As I mentioned before, there's a vast array of data sources available. So there's data sources for pretty much any service you can imagine. There's a vast array of plugins. So any kind of plugin you might want that exists in the React world probably exists in Gatsby. So, for example, React Helmet works with Gatsby fine. We can use data sources like Shopify. So using tools like this really make building with Gatsby a joy. We've got that consistent API, being able to query data from wherever we want. It's really nice to use as a developer. Not only that, but Gatsby has fantastic documentation. Their API reference is amazing. And as I said, the community is really up and coming. So they've got, there's a lot of content out on the internet. There's a lot of tutorials about building with Gatsby, why you should use Gatsby. So, if you didn't find the library or the plugin that you wanted, making that leap to actually building that yourself is actually it's quite easy to get started with things like that, because of the documentation and the content available. And as well, Gatsby's kind of just started pushing. Well, just this year they released something called Gatsby themes. Now, what that sounds like is just kind of a way of distributing kind of UI and skins for your Gatsby site. Well, actually, it's a lot more cool than that, really. Gatsby themes kind of allows you to abstract common functionality and configuration into distributed packages. So you can create a theme for, say, a blog, and actually install that on your Gatsby site via npm, and also compose multiple themes together. So you've got a Gatsby blog theme, you might have a Gatsby commerce theme, and you can kind of use those together in a single unified Gatsby site, whilst the themes are actually responsible for fetching the data, building the pages, and the configuration required of that. Yeah, so what we have here is actually it's an example of sourcing data with Gatsby. Now, what Gatsby gives us is a way to actually kind of dynamically create pages with some Node APIs. So in this example here, we're using create pages, which is it's a Node hook. So what that does is that runs at build time, and inside of this hook, we're actually firing off a GraphQL query there to GraphCMS, and we want to get all of our products back from our GraphCMS project. So once that GraphQL request resolves, we're actually using, we're iterating over that array at the bottom there and using a create page action. And what we do there is we just pass it a path. So in this case, we want to build the page products/product ID. And we give it a component, which is just a vanilla React component, JSX familiarity or there, props, everything like that. And then we pass it context. In this instance, the context is the product that we've just fetched from GraphCMS. So we're passing that data into the component, and then we can kind of render it using React components as we normally would. So these queries would run at build time. So what that means is these pages are generated statically. So the output is essentially HTML. So in this example, we're hitting the GraphCMS API for our project. That's using a native GraphQL API. There are there are, as I said before, there are plenty of source plugins for Gatsby, which essentially wrap non-GraphQL APIs. So if you're working with a third party that doesn't have a GraphQL API, there's likely a source plugin that will kind of wrap that REST API or whatever API in a GraphQL and Gatsby friendly way. So yeah, as we kind of touched on there, GraphQL is kind of the primary method for fetching and querying data in Gatsby. What GraphQL does really is it kind of provides us with a really unified query language to fetch data for our Gatsby site from multiple sources. GraphQL it's kind of very it's one of the very opinionated parts of Gatsby. It's throughout the internals of Gatsby itself. It's obviously heavy in the ecosystem. It's a very opinionated way, and that this is the way they prefer everybody to work with GraphQL. So what is GraphQL? And if you're here and you've not heard of GraphQL, then hopefully I can answer that question for you. So it's a query language for APIs. And what it allows you to do is, and in Gatsby's case, it allows us to declaratively kind of express the data requirements for a page or component. So a query is a representation of that data needs for the page or component that is needed to render. Now, previously, in a REST API, you would kind of just hit an endpoint URL, an API URL, a specific endpoint to get some data back. You would have no idea or no expectation of what data is coming back to you. Whereas with GraphQL, you can kind of explicitly state which fields you require to render on the page. So whilst the data output from a GraphQL API is inherently the same as a REST API, it's just JSON, there are some fantastic benefits from using GraphQL over, say, REST. Let's just check some of those out. So as I just said, with GraphQL, we have to kind of declare which fields we actually want to retrieve. What that results in is kind of more efficient requests, smaller payloads, so it's faster over the network. With a REST API, specific GET request, we would get the entire record back, all of the fields back on that record, regardless of whether we need them or not, or whether they're used, they would be sent back to us. So with GraphQL, we can specify only the data we need, which gives us that kind of smaller payload and faster. Equally, there's nothing unexpected in the response that could break our application or cause issues. And with GraphQL as well, we can actually batch requests. So what we can do is we can kind of batch requests for multiple resources into a single query. So an example of this would be if I wanted to get all of the posts from a blog source, say GraphCMS, and I also wanted to get a collection of products from Shopify. These are separate sources, and normally that would be two separate requests to two different API endpoints. Well, what we can do with GraphQL is actually batch this into a single query. So this makes our application code a lot easier to write and maintain and read. And we've got a single query with all the data requirements for that specific component or page. GraphQL as well plays really nicely with related or reference data. So in the screenshot example there, you can see we're querying for a product, but we also want the category that is related to that product. We want the title of the category related to that product. So we can query for related or reference data. This is powerful. As I said, normally that would be an additional request, but we can kind of, because of that existing relationship defined at the source, we can kind of request the required fields of a resource in a single query. GraphQL is a strong type system. It's heavily typed out of the box. What this gives us is stability and consistency as developers. We're working with the data returned from the API. We know what we're going to get back. We know that a certain field is a string. We know that a certain field should be an integer. And this allows developers to work faster. GraphQL implements a type system using something called scalars. What that does is we assign an element type to a field. This provides a contract between the server, the client, the front end of the front end and the server to define how the data is accessed. So out of the box, GraphQL gives us a handful of scalars, including string, integer, float, boolean, and ID. But we can easily create custom ones using developer tooling. And there's many third-party scalars that already exist that can be easily installed via npm. One of the perhaps underrated benefits of GraphQL, in my opinion, is the self-documenting API. So with your API, the generated schema of the GraphQL server is kind of browsable in GraphQL Playground or Graphical. And that means that the queries, mutations, and fields of all the types, they're all browsable and viewable for anybody who's working with the API. And that makes it easier to build the queries and mutations with the data that we're expecting or the data we need. And also this makes, it's one less thing for you have to maintain or worry about. So because it's self-documenting, if we were working on a team with multiple developers, then we can share that documentation with other developers to get them up to speed faster. And it makes having a separate API reference kind of optional. But GraphQL, as good as it is, it does require some upfront, well, a lot of upfront work and some maintenance. And that's common for any API if you're building it yourself. Designing a schema and writing the resolvers for those queries and mutations is cumbersome. And if you've not done this before, it can be very daunting. So how can we kind of alleviate that? And why would we want to create a GraphQL server? Because we've just talked about how this is the era of the headless CMS, and surely creating our own GraphQL server and hosting our own GraphQL server is a contradiction of that. So how can we, harness the benefits of GraphQL without having to build, host, and maintain our own API? And that's where GraphCMS comes in. So GraphCMS it's the GraphQL CMS, provides us with a native GraphQL API for our data. So this is an example here of the GraphCMS UI. And this is where we build our content models. And it's using a drag and drop interface. So what you can see there is we have a product model. We have various fields that we've created of different types. There are string types. There are integer types. We can even have a reference. We can even have a reference to other models. So at the bottom there, you can see we've got collections, which is a one-to-many reference, or a category, which is one-to-one reference. So once we've built these models in the UI, the schema is automatically generated from those models. And also it's updated alongside any changes we might make. So if we add a new field, our schema is regenerated accordingly. And what that does is that gives us a lovely, consistent, predictable API to query our data from. Not only that, but we get things like pagination, so being able to do offset and limit, filtering, so being able to kind of filter out by specific fields, filter out data by specific fields. We get those for free out the box. Sorting as well, that's available. We just pass those in as arguments to our query. So once we've actually got our schema built, we obviously need to create content for those models. And again, that's done in the UI using a great kind of drag and drop WYSIWYG interface, which is really user-friendly for even non-technical people. We're able to kind of preview content using drafts. So if you're working on a blog post, it's not quite ready to be published and go live, we can use a draft state and actually preview that in development to make sure it looks exactly as we need. We can also have localized content. So GraphCMS has the concept of locales. We can create locales, localize our content into different languages, and then actually query for that data as we need. So when we need the English version of a field, we can specify that. And we might also need the German version of a field. We can pass that in as an argument as well. GraphCMS has a powerful webhook system as well. And that emits events when content is created or updated or deleted, and allow us to trigger actions. So for example, obviously a common one of that would be to rebuild your site with Netlify. You publish a new blog post, we want to trigger a build in Netlify. GraphCMS has the event system to do that. And last but not least, but probably the most undervalued kind of feature of GraphCMS, and it's a feature that barely any competitors have, if any, and that's a mutations API. And that allows us to kind of create and manage content programmatically. So that's a kind of my recap of how we should be building for the web in 2020. We've covered React, we've covered Gatsby, we've covered GraphQL. We've looked at some services, which services we should be using in particular areas. And obviously we've looked at GraphCMS as well as a GraphQL CMS option. Just some recommendations for me, not specific to technology, but just some recommendations for if you're building a new website anytime soon. Obviously, we have to consider the end user when making decisions. I think that's paramount here. It's important that the end user is not forgotten about. It's quite easy to keep the developers happy, but we need to make sure that ultimately what we deliver pleases our customers. And we should be picking the best of breed services, picking best of breed microservices, orchestrating them together. It's pointless having a one size fits all CMS. What we want to do is actually kind of use these smaller services and bring them together, rather than having to kind of bend something to our will to fit the needs. I would say as well we want to abstract away a lot of the pain of web development, and that means things like servers and databases. We talked before about CDNs, we talked before about serverless functions. These are tools that front-end developers can use today as part of your stack and as part of bringing your services together. Nobody wants to have to manage services or worry about uptime or downtime. So I would abstract a lot of that away to the big players like Google, Amazon, Netlify, and then you can focus on really building an awesome experience. And evaluate services and tools accordingly. And that means spend some time to make sure that the tool you're hoping to use is a good fit for everybody involved. You're not just using it because you like it. Make sure that the content creators can work with it too. And if you're picking a content CMS, make sure that the API or the interface is good for the developers that actually building the site as well. So make sure you spend some time doing that before investing too much time in it. And just a couple of things I want to talk about in 2020, things that are coming up. We've kind of touched on Gatsby themes already. That's came about this year, and I think it's only going to get bigger. We've started here at GraphCMS, we've started playing with Gatsby themes around some examples. So hopefully we can share some of those soon. Gatsby Preview is something else. It's their kind of first commercial product that they're offering. and it'll allow you to kind of live preview CMS changes on your Gatsby site, which is pretty cool. So you won't have to wait for a build. It'll be kind of live as it happens changes. Apollo Federation. So this is the idea of a federated schema. So you can have a single Apollo GraphQL server that actually has kind of federates many other GraphQL APIs into a single GraphQL API. So you could pull in your GraphCMS API, you could pull in your Shopify API, and then you've got a single unified API to actually query. So that's something to watch out for. They kind of released that earlier this year. I played around with it a bit. It's pretty nice. And as well on the front end, React Suspense. Obviously, we got hooks this year. Suspense is the next big feature, I think, coming up probably early next year. It's going to make asynchronous data loading in React a lot nicer for a developer, a lot nicer for the user as well. So definitely keep your eyes out for that. That's all from me now. So I think we're going to bring Emily back in and take a few questions, hopefully. Thanks for listening.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Excuse me. Thank you so much for that, Jonathan. That was really interesting. We do have a couple of questions so far, so I'll just go ahead and start with the first one in our chat. This question came in while you were talking about GraphQL, Jonathan. And so this person would like to know, Victor would like to know if GraphQL is something like Swagger. Are you familiar with Swagger, Jonathan?
Yeah, so my understanding of Swagger is it's a specification that it's a way of building APIs, essentially, the Swagger spec. So what you get is it's a way of you kind of define your specification, and that's a way of it's then documented that way. So it's not. I can see where the comparison comes from, in that GraphQL is self-documenting. I would not say that Swagger spec is necessarily like GraphQL, because my understanding of it is that it's a way to document APIs.
Mm-hmm.
So you could use that with, in some instances, you could probably actually use Swagger with GraphQL if you wanted to actually also create your own documentation. But it's mostly common with REST APIs, in my experience.
Cool. Okay, we have another question coming in that says, can we use a different editor to create content? So I'm assuming in GraphCMS. And if so, if the content schema is specified in something like JSON schemas. So first of all, can we use a different content editor to create the content?
Sure. I mean, you could build your own UI because we have the mutations API that allows you to kind of create and manage content that way. So you could create your own GraphCMS UI, as I understand it. So yeah, that is possible. There's nothing available out of the box other than kind of regular mutations. Second question, could you repeat the second question?
Yeah, absolutely. If the content schema specified in something, is the content schema specified in something like JSON schema?
Interesting. I am not sure. So basically how that works is your schema is then kind of, are they asking if they can export their schema? Is that the question? I feel like that's
okay. They've asked a follow-up question. So can the editor interface be integrated with an external taxonomy tool to manage permitted values?
Manage permitted values. So we have a permission system, I believe. So the permission system allows people, you can kind of limit certain roles to be able to create, edit, delete content. That's also the same goes for the actual mutation API. You can create certain API keys that have different permissions attached to them. That would be my recommendation for that.
Okay, awesome. We have another question that's, does GraphCMS connect with Apollo Federation? I know that you talked about this being one of the things to look out for in 2020.
So I've not tried this. I'm not sure if Jamie or Jesse has tried this, but as I understand it, I don't see why not. Because ultimately, it's with the federated the Apollo Federation expects a GraphQL endpoint. What you have is essentially from GraphCMS is you get a GraphQL endpoint. So in theory, the two should work together. It would be interesting we'd like to explore that to see if that's possible, but I don't see why that isn't possible.
Yeah, I know previously we've had a schema stitching tutorial, and I know that there was also some discussion of doing a federation tutorial as well, but there's always something in the content backlog that we're working on, so I'm sure we'll get there soon.
Schema stitching is definitely possible, but obviously Federation's kind of taken over schema stitching. But I don't see why that wouldn't work. So I'll be interested to have a look into that myself, actually.
All right, so we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Wow, everyone is being very active. It's very exciting. So we'll go with someone is using GraphQL along with Angular, Rails as a setup for a SaaS product. Is GraphCMS only a CMS/blog sites, or does it provide any value to feature-heavy SaaS applications?
It's a great question. So yeah, I mean, I think one kind of thing that's associated to CMSs is people just think WordPress, blogs, that kind of thing. So it's kind of a misconception to move away from. So with GraphCMS, obviously you can kind of build the models as you need using the fields. So we've seen examples, we've seen people building quite complex SaaS applications. At the moment, we're building our very own kind of swag store, so that has a commerce element to it. So I don't see why you couldn't kind of start to explore the idea of building a SaaS application. And of course, you've got the mutation API as well for those kind of to actually write to the CMS. So that's really a differentiating factor that would help in the case of a SaaS application.
Okay, perfect. All right, so a couple more questions we have. Let me just look through. So is it possible to create custom data types within GraphCMS?
So what you can do is there is a JSON type. So we can have JSON field types. You can dump a bunch of JSON in there. In terms of custom field types, what you can do kind of is it's kind of like link, essentially have a relationship to another model, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So you'd essentially have a field which is a relationship to another model, and then you can kind of obviously use the rest of the fields there. In terms of creating completely custom fields, I'm not sure what exactly they have in mind. If they have an example, then we can probably explore that a bit further. But obviously, in the UI, you can kind of you can name your field however you want. There's a select field type there. If they have a specific field type in mind, we could probably answer that a bit better. But in most cases, what we say for people who are doing it that way is they use the JSON field type.
Perfect. And just something to note, I'm seeing this also in the comments, but GraphCMS has a great Slack community. And so if people are kind of running into specific questions or want kind of a more personal response to a question they have after the webinar, like that's also a great place to get some of these questions answered. And I know our dev ads or advocates are really active in that as well.
Sure, you can hit me up on Twitter as well.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a couple more questions and then we'll wrap it up. So I think this one's really interesting, especially considering for a headless CMS. If pitted against something like WordPress, how far is GraphCMS in terms of admin options with live editing directly on the page?
So live editing directly on the page, I assume they mean, yeah, so you kind of want that preview thing. So that's not, we don't have live preview right now. The best option that is available is, as I said, is kind of the creating a specific API key that will give you access to drafts. And then you can kind of deploy those as and when to Netlify, etc. What other part of WordPress were they interested in? Sorry.
If you're comparing it to something like WordPress, so I think you've kind of answered it in terms of the live preview.
Oh, okay. So live preview. Yeah. So that's not really possible right now. With Gatsby preview, that's that would kind of tie it exclusively Gatsby preview, but that's that's an exciting avenue to look into.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just another question that we've had someone DM us is, with all of these companies, we see a lot of competition in terms of developers, and with a lot of these API first products, you need really great developers. So how can an employer become more attractive to web developers?
How can an employer become more attractive to web developers?
Hmm.
Is that I'm not sure. I'm not sure I understand the question.
Like what can a company do to make themselves more attractive for web developers when they're looking for new hires and that sort of thing?
Oh, right. Okay. I was waiting for the kind of GraphCMS angle, product angle on that. Okay, no. So I would say, I think in this day and age, personally speaking, I've joined GraphCMS recently, and one thing that I liked about GraphCMS was that it's remote. Um, so that's, I think, a lot of developers kind of look for that now, remote work and the flexibility side of things. We don't need to necessarily be in an office desk every day of the week, and the tools we have on the internet allow us to work anywhere. So that's really important to me. So the majority of the Graph CMS team are in Germany, myself I'm in
Mhm.
England. So you know that's an important thing. I would also say, personally speaking, I would say that the technologies that you use, the technologies that you advocate, that's important to a lot of developers. They're going to be much more interested to work on your product if, as an example, they're using GraphQL or they're using Gatsby or they're using React. So that attracts people as well. Yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, perfect. And then last one, what kind of events do you recommend to keep up with all of these new technologies and all of these new tools? Are there any upcoming events that you really recommend for following these progress?
They just missed the best one of the year, right? GraphQL Day.
Ja, GraphQL Bodensee.
Um, yeah, so I'm not sure what's coming up. So we have React Advanced tomorrow, and my colleague Jamie is speaking there. What I would say is, in particular, is go back and check out the videos for GraphQL Day on YouTube, and also go and look at the Jamstack Conf. There was one just in San Francisco. So there's a lot of smart people there who are doing really cool things with GraphQL. Um, Gatsby, React, Jamstack stuff. So um, yeah,
Yeah,
there's two or three of those a year, Jamstack comps. There's obviously GraphQL Conf, which is in the summer. So yeah, I mean all these talks are generally available on YouTube, so just kind of check those out. And as
yeah.
well, I would say podcasts. Listen to podcasts if you can. You can kind of get a glimpse of like what's up and coming on podcasts.
For sure. And just another quick event that I know is coming up in December, on December 5th or 6th, I believe it's the 6th, is React Conference here in Berlin. So that's another great opportunity, since probably if you don't already have a ticket to React Advanced, you'll miss the event tomorrow. But coming up in December, there's also React Conference here in Berlin. So if you're in the area, grab a ticket and come visit us. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. This was really helpful and interesting, and thank you everyone for tuning in as well. Just if you are interested or have any more questions about anything that Jonathan covered, feel free to join our Slack community or follow us on Twitter. DM Jonathan on Twitter, reach out to us, and we'll get back to you if you have any kind of questions. So thank you guys so much for attending, and looking forward to seeing you at the next webinar.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. Hope you enjoyed it. Speak to you soon.